Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over Live. Even before its release, the Pope's encyclical was being drawn into the usual partisan divisions. Joining us to discuss the politics of the encyclical, the economics, and the parts you probably have not seen is Robert Royal, author of the book Virgin and the Dynamo, The Use and Abuse of Religion in Environmental Debates, and he's also the editor of thecatholicthing.org. Robert, thank you for being here. I want to play this little bit from you from the press release of the encyclical this morning. This is Professor John Schellenhuber. He's the founder and director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research and one of the presenters of the encyclical. He had this to say about wealthy nations. Listen.
All the people in this plot, so about 7 billion people, you rank them by income. So the bottom billion has almost nothing, but on the vertical axis, it's the emissions of that part of humanity. And you see the bottom billion doesn't contribute anything to greenhouse gas emissions. It's all done by the upper billions. So it's not poverty that destroys the environment. It is wealth, consumption, and waste.
It's wealth, consumption, and waste, and the North is primarily to blame. Your thought about this idea that's been set up, and there is some of it in the encyclical, that the North and South are somehow, one is preying on the other and growing as a result of pillaging the natural resources in the South.
Yeah, I think that this is a very simplistic and even dangerous way to consider what's going on globally, because actually it's not true that the bottom billion don't contribute anything to the carbon that's in the air, because most of the people at a subsistence level burn sticks, they burn animal dung, and these are very, very polluting ways to cook, to heat a home, etc. It's actually development, good development, with good regulation, etc., that it becomes cleaner. I mean, what are the cleanest places to live on Earth? It's Europe, it's the United States, it's Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the places that have become wealthy. And furthermore, the idea that somehow we have benefited because they have not benefited, this is a very European and I think sometimes South American view as well. You know, in Europe right now, they're having a problem with Greece, and the Greeks are trying to make the argument that, well, the Germans benefited from the economic system and the industrialized system, and we didn't, although they got all sorts of subsidies from the Germans along the way. So there's an attempt here, I think, a very illegitimate attempt to make people feel guilty because they've succeeded in developing and spreading wealth out, while others have not. I mean, the real place to focus is how do we raise up those billion?
What do you make of John Schellenhuber as one of the announcers, if you will, of this encyclical? He is a rather, I don't think it's beyond the pale to say, a rather extreme advocate of climate change. I mean, this is a man who thinks the Earth should only contain 1 billion people because that's all it can hold and sustain.
Yeah, he's a very troubling man. I mean, he's also said the United States must get down to zero carbon dioxide emissions by 2020, which is an utter ridiculous thing to say. It's not going to happen. I find that very disturbing. In fact, I asked Archbishop Kurtz before we came on tonight what he made of the fact that Schellenhuber was there, and he said, well, he wanted someone who's outside the Catholic and the Christian orbit. He wanted a kind of a secularist.
An atheist?
An atheist. And that's all well and good, but it's puzzling why the Vatican chose a man who is not only not on board with Catholicism, but seems to be really at the very extreme edge of environmental thinking.
I want to get into some of these quotes. The first deals with ecological debt, and it touches on what we were just talking about, the economic factor here. It says, a true ecological debt exists, particularly between the global North and South, connected to commercial imbalances with effects on the environment and the disproportionate use of natural resources by certain countries over long periods of time. This is a quote, by the way, from the Bolivian Bishops' Conference. This goes hand in hand with the call for penalties and enforceable global agreements. Is that the direction we should be going? And is that, again, a prudential judgment on the part of the Pope?
Well, it is a prudential judgment because it's not self-evident that the North is wealthy because the South is poor. One of the jokes is that if people had not invented the internal combustion engine, that the Saudi Arabians would still be living in tents in the desert because the oil that exists there would be of no use. Yeah. So it's human invention, it's human development, it's this human capacity to create, to be co-creators with God, that is the way out of these environmental difficulties. It's true that the Bolivian mines have been exploited for various purposes, but they weren't used by other nations that could have used them for their own development. So we can't, and look, part of the thing we always have to say is, are there polluters, are there exploiters, are there evil men and women who use the power that exists in the first world to harm people in the third world? Of course. But that's not the whole story. And I think it shifts the real debate that needs to go on into a place that is not particularly helpful.
Some of our email correspondents are saying, wait a minute, what about the dictatorships in South and Central America? Don't they bear some of the responsibility here, who kept aid from their people and allowed their people to live in the poverty that they currently occupy?
When you talk to people who do development, there are usually three things that they point toward that are absolutely essential to begin to raise people out of abject poverty, not just being poor, but abject poverty. They need clean water so that they don't have illnesses and they can grow crops. They need electricity, because electricity is actually, other than coal-generated electricity, is one of the cleanest ways to heat a home, to cook, etc. And they need orderly political systems, because as we know, if a government is basically a mafia masquerading as a government, and a lot of governments in the world are, probably at least 150 in the UN are broadly describable that way. Well, of course they can't make good use of their economic situation. Argentina, to take the Pope's home nation, was the 6th largest economy in the world in the early part of the 20th century. It's now dropped off considerably from them, and it's not because of there are no more natural resources or they do not have a talented people. It's because of their politics.
Wow. Okay, let's get into the things people did not hear about this encyclical. I want to put this up on the screen. The Pope says, and this is about abortion, since everything is interrelated, concern for the protection of nature is also incompatible with the justification of abortion. How can we genuinely teach the importance of concern for other vulnerable beings, however troublesome or inconvenient they may be, if we fail to protect a human embryo, even when its presence is uncomfortable and creates difficulties? Now, this was an interesting insertion in the body of what initially was supposed to be an environmental encyclical, because he's showing how this is part of the environment, human life.
Yeah, there are 5 or 6 places where he does things like that, about population control, abortion, experimentation.
Well, it's all creation.
It's all creation. And at a deep philosophical level, in my column today in the Catholic Thing, I wrote about this. This is really a response to the idea that begins with the scientific revolution, that man is the master of nature. And not only is he the master of physical nature for his own uses, he's the master now of his own body. He can use biomedical techniques to alter his gender, as we've started to see. I mean, even these very radical things. And I think at the very deepest level, what he's saying is the same drive for mastery and exploitation that some people have manifested in their relationships with the physical world manifests itself in that same disrespect toward life in the womb.
Yeah, I want to go to this next bite, and this is about population control, which, as we talked with Archbishop Kurtz, if you concede that human activity is to blame for the crisis in the climate, then people become a targeted class. And the Pope says, no, instead of resolving the problems of the poor and thinking of how the world can be different, some can only propose a reduction in the birth rate. At times, developing countries face forms of international pressure which make economic assistance contingent on certain policies of reproductive health. To blame population growth instead of extreme and selective consumerism on the part of some is one way of refusing to face the issues. Is that a shot at the UN and its default cure-all for any climate problems or development problems?
I wish it were. I don't know, and I wish it were more explicitly so, because if there is one institution in the world that does exactly what the Holy Father says you shouldn't do.
Well, that's what he's, yeah, clearly he's saying that economic assistance contingents on reproductive health, if that doesn't have the ring of the UN about it, I don't know what that does.
Yeah, and it's very curious because in many other ways he's calling upon these large international meetings to try to do things. And we know the way...
And a global authority to oversee the environment.
And we know the way that the United States and the EU tend to manipulate these meetings when they come together. The United States, particularly with this administration, which has been, I think we can fairly say, anti-Catholic, and it does not respect life the way that the Holy Father would like. The developed world has sought to impose these ideas on the developing world. Now, it hasn't been very successful because places like China and India and Brazil, these large population countries, are in the process of development, and they, even politically, it's utterly impossible for them to turn in the direction that the UN would like to see it. And so when the Holy Father talks about the failure of previous international soirees, you know, to get together to talk about these things, it's going to happen again in Paris, despite the appeal that he's put out there, because the national interests of these very large countries just don't allow them to turn in the direction of massive reductions of carbon dioxide emissions. And without that, there's really no command answer to the climate change question, if it is the problem to the degree he's been saying.
There is a question whether all of this governmental intervention achieves much. I mean, the EU is committing itself, I was told today, trillions of dollars. And the expectation is that over the next 85 years, they will only bring the temperature down by a fraction of a point in 85 years to the cost of trillions and trillions of dollars. Wouldn't that money be better spent actually helping develop these countries that are oppressed and that don't have the development they need now, water and basic sanitation?
Yeah, Bjorn Lomborg, who is a statistician, has a very interesting piece today in the USA Today. He's the kind of guy who, he's a numbers cruncher. He isn't into the big picture. He just wants to know what's going to work. And he has an institute in Denmark which has for years been trying to say he's a believer that global warming exists. It's a problem. He doesn't believe it's quite as extreme or as drastic as comes through, I think, in this encyclical. And he has looked at what would be the best ways to use money. It's not to try to control growth. The best thing to do is to try to stimulate innovation in ways to generate energy, ways to become more efficient in using energy. Those are the things that
the Pope says that's an over-reliance on technology. There's a whole section of it here where he says you're trusting technology to get you out of this, and we can't do that. It won't work.
Yeah. Well, see, I think we need a spirituality of technology. In one place, in several places, he talks about the way our social media and whatnot have actually divorced us from one another. We don't have these face-to-face interactions the way we used to, and how they've kind of destroyed our inner cities because they become too technologized. I think that critique is correct, and there's a deep critique that he draws out of Romano Guardini, one of the great theologians of the 20th century, an inspirer of Benedict and John Paul II and whatnot. But it's impossible to solve this problem without better, more sophisticated technologies and a more enlightened way of using them. I think it's good to try to encourage that as well as a more ascetic lifestyle.
So in the final takeaway, we are to, and at least my understanding is, we are to read this with care, pray on it, think about it, consider it, allow it to affect, and it is a challenging document, and it challenges me a lot as I was reading it, thinking, my gosh, I should be more aware of this or that. But we don't have to accept all the prescriptions necessarily that the Pope offers here. These are just his personal musings and prudential judgments.
Well, I'm not sure about that. I think that this is sort of a summary of some people he's been speaking with. I don't think that Bergoglio in Argentina was studying the environment. We have no evidence that he's paid a lot of attention to this prior to becoming Pope. It seems to me that the vision of nature, the vision of creation, is really quite inspiring. I mean, the heart of Bergoglio, that warm, amazing, charismatic man, comes through in those passages remarkably. When he turns to the policy questions and an actual description of the case, he tends in that Schellenhuber direction where everything seems drastic and dire, and maybe he's slightly overstating it to try to urge people forward a little bit, but I wouldn't even call them prudential judgments. When the Holy Father,
what would you call them?
I think he's registering what he believes are the best ideas from people who have come to him, or maybe were part of a team that helped him put this together. Because I have to say, as a writer myself, I think the document is an impressive bit of writing. It isn't necessarily entirely self-consistent, and it's not only technology, not technology. There are other things in it that are not necessarily self-consistent. But there's a spirit and there's an energy that comes through this, even despite the many things that you might disagree with in terms of the policy.
No, as you said, there are poetic patches, particularly the end, very mystical and has a very different feel from the rest of the encyclical, but it's beautiful, and it ends with 2 new prayers that he's composed. Yeah. 30 seconds, I have to ask you this. Sandro Magister, the journalist who released that draft up front, actually his editor got a copy of it. He wrote an introduction. The Vatican press office stripped him of his credential. A good deal because he broke the embargo, or was he subject to the embargo?
Hard to say. I mean, it seems to me that somebody wanted a somewhat critical voice, which Sandro has been lately, of the Vatican, to have this early. I don't know. My sources in Rome don't seem to know why it happened either. I think probably he had to be stripped of his press credentials for a while, but he'll be back.
Yeah, it makes certainly makes the Pope look bad, particularly after the Vatileaks scandal that he was supposed to clean up. Leaking materials, it certainly was, it seems to me, an effort to embarrass the Pope. It's not a good thing. Robert Royal, thank you for being here. I'm going to tweet Robert's article, which was fantastic, from this morning, so look for that.